The marble courtroom felt colder than it should have for late October. Sarah Martinez sat ramrod straight at the plaintiff's table, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the leash that her knuckles had turned white. Her golden retriever bear sat beside her, unusually still, unusually alert. His amber eyes stayed locked on her face, waiting, always waiting. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. The courtroom smelled of old wood polish and fear, her fear, though she was trying desperately not to let it show. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly institutional glow, and the American flag in the corner seemed to mock her with its promise of justice and fairness. She'd learned over the course of 6 months of depositions and legal battles that justice wasn't fair. It was procedural. It was about who could afford the better lawyer, who could perform credibility most convincingly, and who had already decided which version of the truth they believed. Derek sat 3 tables away, impossibly composed in an expensive charcoal suit that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His lawyer, a man named Callahan with silver hair and the kind of practiced authority that came from winning 100 custody cases, was whispering something into his ear. Sarah could read Derek's body language from where she sat, the slight smile, the relaxed shoulders, the way he kept glancing at his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. They looked rehearsed, confident. Everything about his posture said he'd already won. This was the thing about Derek that had taken Sarah 5 years of marriage to fully understand. He didn't just lie. He believed his own lies. He had the capacity to rewrite history so completely that he could convince himself, and everyone around him, that black was white, that his hands had never hurt anyone, that his accusations were love, that his control was protection. He was a pharmaceutical sales executive, which meant he'd spent a decade learning how to be persuasive, how to make people believe things that weren't true, how to smile through objections and turn doubt into certainty. And it had worked on everyone. His mother believed him. His colleagues believed him. The marriage counselor had taken 6 sessions before Sarah realized he was coaching Derek on what to say. Even some of Sarah's friends had drifted away, unsure which version of the story was real, uncomfortable with the intensity of accusation. But not Bear. The dog had never been fooled. Sarah's sister, Maria, sat in the 3rd row with their mother, both of them pressed shoulder to shoulder like they were bracing for impact. Maria had taken time off work. She couldn't afford to, but she'd done it anyway. Their mother had her rosary beads, the same ones she'd used every day since Sarah's father died 15 years ago. Sarah could hear the soft click-click-click of the beads as her mother moved them through her fingers, a prayer in Spanish that Sarah knew by heart: protection, safety, truth, justice. A handful of journalists occupied the back, their phones already out, ready to capture whatever happened next. The local news had been covering the story for weeks, not because it was unique, but because Derek had made sure it was public. He'd given interviews, framed Sarah as an unstable ex-wife trying to keep him from his children, painted himself as a victim of false accusations. He'd moved in his social circles, gathering character witnesses, building a narrative so airtight that by the time they got to court, half the town had already made up their minds about who was telling the truth. Sarah had made the opposite choice. She tried to stay quiet. She tried to keep the children's names out of the news. She tried to let the legal system do what it was supposed to do. But the legal system was a machine built to protect people like Derek, people with money, people with charm, people who understood that whoever controlled the narrative controlled the verdict. This was the custody hearing everyone in town had been talking about. 7 years of marriage, 2 children, allegations that had shattered a family and made the local news for weeks, though the way the story was told, you'd think Sarah was the one who'd done the shattering. The bailiff stood and the room went absolutely silent. All rise, the Honorable Judge Patricia Whitmore presiding. Judge Whitmore entered with the weight of her position evident in every step. She was a woman in her 60s, maybe 70s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen everything. She had a reputation in town, fair, they said, intelligent, not easily fooled. But she also had a reputation for believing statistics. Custody generally went to mothers, yes, but in cases of disputed abuse allegations, judges were cautious. They didn't want to upend a child's relationship with a parent based on accusations alone. They wanted evidence, proof, something concrete. Sarah had none of those things. She had bruises that had healed. She had recordings of Derek's voice that her lawyer said wouldn't hold up in court. She had the testimony of her children, both of whom she'd avoided coaching because she wanted them to tell the truth, which meant they'd said things in their depositions that made it sound like maybe she was exaggerating. Maybe it wasn't as bad as she claimed, maybe. The most damaging thing, maybe they still wanted to see their dad. Judge Whitmore glanced at the documents before her, scanning them with the speed of someone who'd read 1,000 custody petitions. Then she looked up, her gaze sharp and assessing. It landed on the plaintiff's table, took in Sarah's terrified face, then moved to Bear. Her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for Sarah to see it. The judge leaned forward. "I notice we have a dog in the courtroom," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like steel. "Ms. Martinez, would you like to explain that?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. This was the moment. Everything depended on what she said next, and she could see in the judge's expression that she was already skeptical. The court was already against her. She was a woman with accusations and no solid proof, just bruises that had healed, recordings that wouldn't hold up, and the word of her children, which Derek's team had already torn apart in depositions with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Bear shifted slightly beside her, his 70-pound golden body pressing against her left leg. He could sense her heart rate, her blood pressure rising, the spike of adrenaline flooding her system. She'd learned from his trainer that dogs could smell fear, not metaphorically but literally. Anxiety releases adrenaline, which changes body chemistry, which dogs can detect. And once a dog detects distress in someone they love, their own nervous system begins to respond in kind. Sarah could feel Bear's breathing change, could feel him settling his weight more firmly against her leg, grounding her, holding her down to earth when she felt like she might float away from sheer terror. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Bear is a PTSD service dog. I need him here." The lie tasted like metal on her tongue, bitter, heavy. It sat in her mouth like a stone. Bear wasn't registered as a service dog. She'd purchased him from a private trainer who specialized in trauma detection, a practice that existed in a gray area of legality, whose efficacy was hotly debated by veterinary behaviorists and psychologists. But it wasn't entirely false either. Bear had been trained to do specific things. He had been trained to read her physiology, to detect changes in her stress hormones, to respond with deep pressure, to ground her when her nervous system was in flight or fight mode. He was a service dog in practice, even if not in law. And everyone in this room was about to find out why she'd brought him here. Derek's lawyer immediately stood, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a transparent attempt to manipulate the proceedings with an emotional prop. The presence of an animal in this courtroom is inappropriate and—" But Judge Whitmore raised her hand and the lawyer went silent immediately. She was still looking at Sarah, studying her with an intensity that made Sarah feel completely exposed, completely seen. The judge leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face, and Sarah could see her making a calculation, weighing, considering. "We'll proceed," Judge Whitmore said quietly, "but the dog stays in place and does not interfere. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah whispered. As Derek's lawyer began his opening statement, his voice dripping with insinuation and false sympathy for a man caught in the web of a vindictive ex-wife's lies, Sarah felt Bear's warm body press more firmly against her leg. His breathing was calm, measured, methodical. He was already doing what he'd been trained to do, grounding her, keeping her present, reading the subtle shifts in her body chemistry that nobody else in this courtroom could detect. The lawyer was painting Derek as a victim, A man trying to maintain a relationship with his children while their mother poisoned them against him. A man falsely accused, facing the destruction of his relationship with his kids because a woman couldn't move on from a divorce. Sarah's hands began to shake. Bear's pressure deepened. And that's when Sarah realized something that made her breath catch. Derek had no idea what was about to happen. The judge had just given her permission. By allowing Bear in the courtroom, Judge Whitmore had inadvertently opened a door that Derek couldn't see coming. A door that would let a trained dog do exactly what he'd been trained to do: to sit in a courtroom and bear witness, to respond to danger and deception in ways that Derek couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't hide from. Derek thought he'd already won, but the judge had just started asking questions, and Bear was about to provide answers that no amount of charm or legal maneuvering could make disappear. Callahan stood up with the kind of calculated grace that suggested every movement had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. He was a man who understood the theater of law, how to dress, how to move, how to time a pause for maximum effect. His suit was impeccable. His hair was silver at the temples in that way that looked distinguished rather than aging. When he smiled, you believed that he was your friend, that he was on your side, that he was fighting for what was right. Sarah had seen him do this before, in depositions, in preliminary hearings, in every interaction where he positioned himself as the voice of reason against Sarah's hysteria, against her accusations, against what he would soon describe as her narrative of victimization. He began his opening statement by doing something brilliant. He validated the judge's concern. "Your Honor, I appreciate your fairness in hearing both sides of this matter. What we have here is a tragic situation where a family has been torn apart. And yes, there are allegations of abuse. We don't minimize that. Allegations are serious. They deserve to be heard." He paused, letting that sink in, letting the judge feel validated for letting him speak. "However," he continued, his voice shifting slightly, becoming more intimate, more confiding, "what the evidence will show is that these allegations are not what they appear to be. They are the product of a woman in crisis, a woman going through a difficult divorce, a woman who has lost control of the narrative, and I mean that quite literally. The children are bonding with their father. The custody arrangement was changing. And in that moment of loss, Ms. Martinez did what many desperate people do. She rewrote history." He began to walk slowly, deliberately, like he was taking the judge on a journey through the truth. "The bruises, we'll see that they're consistent with normal childhood accidents. The recordings will demonstrate they were edited, taken out of context, manipulated to sound worse than they were. The children's statements, we have therapists who will testify that they are consistent with parental alienation, a well-documented psychological phenomenon where one parent systematically poisons a child's relationship with the other parent by making false abuse claims." He said false abuse claims with the kind of confident certainty that made Sarah feel like she was losing her mind, as though she hadn't lived through the fear, as though the bruises hadn't been real, as though her children's terror was a performance they'd been coached to deliver. "What you will see," Callahan concluded, "is a mother who loves her children very much but who has lost perspective on what is in their best interest. And what's in their best interest is a relationship with both parents, unimpeded, unstigmatized by false allegations." He sat down. Sarah felt something collapse inside her chest. This was the problem with the system, she understood now. It wasn't that people didn't believe abuse happened. It was that they believed it could be weaponized, that women could use it as a tool, that maternal love and vindictiveness were so close together that they became indistinguishable. Callahan had just planted a seed in Judge Whitmore's mind. What if this is real, but what if it's also manipulation? And in the absence of a confession, in the absence of Derek getting drunk and admitting everything, that seed would grow into reasonable doubt. Bear shifted beside her, and Sarah realized his entire demeanor had changed. His usual calm had transformed into something more alert. His ears were forward. His breathing had shifted from the slow, meditative rhythm of a resting dog into something sharper, more attentive. He could sense the shift in the room's emotional energy. He could feel Sarah's despair beginning to crystallize into something else, panic. Then Sarah's lawyer, Patricia Chen, young, scrappy, brilliant, but facing a system that had been built long before she was born, stood to give the counter-opening. She was good. Sarah had watched her work during the depositions, and she was genuinely good. She talked about documented injuries with medical records. She referenced text messages from Derek that were controlling, abusive in their tone and content. She brought up the therapist's notes about the children's anxiety, their hypervigilance, their conflicted feelings about their father. But Chen was fighting the current. Sarah could feel it. The evidence will show, Chen concluded, that Sarah Martinez is a protective mother who has fought against tremendous odds to keep her children safe. She is not a vengeful ex-wife. She is a woman who witnessed harm to her children and did what every mother should do. She protected them. It sounded hollow in the silence of the courtroom. The journalists in the back were already typing, and Sarah could see the story taking shape in their heads like words forming on a screen. Contentious custody battle. Accusations disputed. He said, she said. He said, she said. Those 5 words were the death knell of every abuse case that lacked a video recording or a hospital admission. Because in a system built on reasonable doubt, the absence of absolute proof meant the accused could not be believed to be guilty. It meant the accuser's trauma was just as likely to be a fiction as a fact. Sarah's hands began to shake. Her vision started to narrow. She could feel her breathing becoming shallow, could feel the panic attack building in her chest like a pressure system about to become a storm. Her heart was racing so fast she was certain everyone could hear it. That's when Bear did something she'd never quite seen before. He didn't just press against her leg. His entire body went rigid. His muscles tensed like he was preparing for a physical threat. His eyes widened slightly and his pupils dilated. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, he looked like a dog who'd caught the scent of danger. And then he adjusted his position, turning his entire body weight into a deep pressure against her leg. Not comforting, insistent, demanding. It was the move he'd been trained to use when Sarah's nervous system was in true crisis, when a panic attack was imminent, when he needed to literally force her body to reset by applying firm, deep pressure. Sarah's whole body went rigid against the pressure. She couldn't move forward. She couldn't move backward. She could only breathe. And as her body forced itself to match Bear's slower rhythm, her nervous system began to recalibrate. The panic attack that had been building in her chest, the one that would have embarrassed her, that would have made her look unstable to the judge, that would have destroyed her case completely, because nothing undermines a woman's credibility like crying hysterically in court, didn't happen. She sat, shaking slightly, with Bear's body serving as an anchor. Derek's lawyer was speaking again, but Sarah couldn't quite hear the words. She was aware of the judge, though. Judge Whitmore's eyes had moved away from Derek's lawyer. They were fixed on Bear. Not on Derek, not on the testimony. On the dog. The judge's expression had shifted. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, a small furrow between her brows. But it was the expression of someone who had noticed something, someone who was making a calculation. Someone was asking herself, why did that dog just change its behavior? What was he responding to? Sarah watched as the judge leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face. Judge Whitmore's eyes remained on Bear for several more seconds before returning to the testimony, but something had changed in how she was listening. Her entire body language had shifted into a position of deeper attention. As Callahan guided Derek through a few more softball questions, softballs that Derek caught and hit out of the park with his perfect blend of wounded vulnerability and righteous confusion, Sarah realized something crucial. The judge was no longer just listening to words. She was watching the dog. And in that watching, she'd begun to ask a different set of questions than Callahan had anticipated. Not, is this woman telling the truth? But rather, what is the dog responding to? What is the dog detecting that the lawyers aren't saying out loud? Because animals don't lie. They don't have the capacity for the sophisticated deception that human beings have perfected. And a judge, a smart judge, an observant judge, might begin to wonder what a trained dog's behavior could tell her about the truth that human testimony could not. The next morning, Sarah arrived at court with Emma and Lucas, her children, Emma 14 and already hardened by what she'd witnessed, her face a mask of precarious control. Lucas was 11, still caught in that painful limbo between childhood and understanding, his small body tense with the weight of secrets no child should carry. They sat in the back with Maria. Neither child had to testify. Thank God for that small mercy. Sarah had fought for that, had told Chen repeatedly that she didn't want to put her children through the ordeal of testifying. But something had shifted overnight. Sarah could see it in Chen's face when she'd arrived that morning. A decision had been made. The prosecution, represented by Chen, called their first witness, Dr. Michael Torres, a clinical psychologist who had evaluated both children for trauma. He was meticulous, clinical, devastating in his precision. His voice was calm as he described behavioral patterns. The hypervigilance that made Emma flinch at loud noises, the way Lucas had developed a stutter that only appeared when his father was mentioned, the internalized shame both children carried, the belief that somehow they were responsible for the violence they'd witnessed. When I assessed Emma, Torres said, his voice steady and professional, she exhibited classic signs of complex trauma, not just from a single incident, but from prolonged exposure to verbal aggression, physical intimidation, and coercive control. When I asked her about her father, she would freeze. Her heart rate would spike. She would minimize his behavior while simultaneously describing incidents that objectively constitute abuse. Sarah watched the judge take notes, watched her expression remain neutral, professional. Then Callahan stood for cross-examination and his voice changed. It became sympathetic, understanding, almost pitying. Dr. Torres, isn't it possible that the children's mother planted these ideas? That she coached them before therapy? That she's a highly manipulative woman using vulnerable children as props in a custody dispute? It was brilliant, it was poison. That's possible, Torres admitted carefully, his clinical training preventing him from getting defensive. But my assessment includes observations from school counselors, teachers, medical professionals who have observed the children independently of the mother's influence. The consistency of their responses across multiple evaluators would make coordinated coaching unlikely. But you didn't observe the home environment yourself, did you? Callahan pressed, his voice still gentle, still sympathetic. You relied on the children's testimony, which they could have been coached to deliver. Torres hesitated, and that hesitation was everything. In a courtroom, hesitation reads as doubt, and doubt reads as weakness. Watching this, Sarah felt something break inside her. The system wasn't built for this. The evidence wasn't strong enough. The judge would split custody, Derek would maintain access, and he'd do it all again, more carefully this time, more covertly, with better understanding of what he couldn't get away with. And the children would grow up in a system that had decided their fear wasn't reliable enough to warrant protection. Bear sensed the despair immediately. His breathing quickened. He began a subtle packing against the limits of his leash, a sign that Sarah had learned meant he was detecting something critical in her internal state, some shift in her neurochemistry that only he could perceive. She touched his head, trying to ground herself in his presence, but her hand was shaking. That's when Chen made her move. The prosecution calls Emma Martinez. Sarah's stomach dropped through the floor. They weren't supposed to testify, Chen had said, but Chen had changed her mind overnight, believing that Emma's testimony might be the thing that broke through the narrative. That sometimes a judge needed to hear directly from a child, not filtered through an expert, not mediated through professional language. Sometimes a judge needed to see the reality in a young person's face. Emma stood up slowly from the bench in the back. Sarah watched her daughter's entire body language shift, the way she stood, the way she walked, the careful control she was exerting over every muscle. Emma was 14 years old and had aged 10 years in the last 6 months. She'd learned to perform normalcy, to hide her fear, to be small and quiet so that her father wouldn't notice her. She was sworn in. Chen's voice was gentle, the voice of someone who understood they were asking a child to do something unbearably hard. Emma, I know this is hard, but I want to ask you about something that happened last February. Do you remember the day your mother took you to the hospital? Emma's jaw tightened. She didn't look at Sarah. She looked at some point above everyone's heads, a technique she'd learned to dissociate from her body when it became too frightening to inhabit. Yes. Why did you go to the hospital? There was a long pause. Sarah could see Emma's hands trembling in her lap, could see her daughter taking deep breaths, steeling herself. And then Emma's eyes drifted toward Derek, who was watching her with an expression of such wounded confusion that anyone without context would believe he had no idea what she was about to say. That's when something changed in Emma's body language. The protective posture came on like a shield. The flinch was visible, physical, undeniable. My dad, Emma's voice cracked like old wood. She stopped, tried again. He pushed me. I hit my head on the corner of the kitchen counter. The room went perfectly quiet. Sarah could feel every eye in the courtroom turning toward Derek, could see the calculations happening on every face. Is she telling the truth? Does she look credible? Is she performing this or living it? And what happened after that? Chen asked softly. Mom wanted to call the police. Dad said if she did, he'd make sure we never saw her again. That I'd chosen him and my brother would choose him and we'd be happy, and Mom would be alone. Callahan was on his feet immediately. Objection. That's hearsay, and the witness is clearly reciting a coached narrative. I'm not coached. Emma's voice suddenly exploded like a cracked whip across the courtroom. I'm not lying. He said that. He said it while he was holding ice on my head and Mom was crying and he was acting like I had done something wrong for bleeding on the floor. Tears were streaming down her face now. Real, raw, 14-year-old tears that carried the weight of 6 months of silence, of therapy sessions where she'd learned to articulate the unarticulated, of the impossible burden of having to convince adults that your own father had hurt you. The entire courtroom seemed to inhale. And that's when everyone saw it. Bear stood up. Not in agitation, not in distress, but in a deliberate, measured way that suggested purposefulness. Sarah had let the leash out slightly that morning, sensing that the dog needed more freedom. Bear walked forward with intentional steps, his entire body focused on Emma, and pressed his entire body weight against her chair from the side. His head came to rest against her leg, his body a firm, warm pressure that anchored her to something real, something present, something that said, "You are not alone. You are not crazy. Your body's truth matters." The entire courtroom watched as a traumatized child, in the middle of testifying against her abusive father, found grounding in a dog's silent, loyal presence. Judge Whitmore saw it. More than that, she saw what it meant. She watched Emma's breathing slow, watched the child's shoulders come down from around her ears, watched a 14-year-old find the courage to continue testifying because a 70-pound golden retriever had moved to her side and said, without words, "I believe you." This wasn't just a service dog for anxiety anymore. This was something else entirely. Callahan was sputtering, trying to get the court to see the dog as a distraction, a manipulation, an emotional exploitation of the judicial process. But Judge Whitmore held up her hand. "The witness has answered the question," she said firmly. "Cross-examination, counsel." Callahan's cross-examination fell apart because every time he pushed Emma, suggesting she was lying, suggesting she'd been coached, suggesting that maybe she was confused or exaggerating. Bear's entire physiology shifted. His ears perked forward. His breathing quickened. His muscles tensed subtly, visibly, undeniably. He became alert in the way that prey animals become alert to predators. And every time Emma told the truth, Bear's body relaxed. He became still, became present, became the embodiment of calm acceptance. It was like watching a biological lie detector in real time. The judge was watching the dog like a hawk. Her eyes never left Bear's face as Callahan asked his questions. She was watching the animal respond to Emma's testimony with more attention than she gave to the legal arguments themselves. And Sarah realized what was happening. Judge Whitmore wasn't just observing animal behavior anymore. She was using it as an interpretive framework. She was watching the dog as a kind of barometer of truth, a real-time validator of whether the words coming from Emma's mouth aligned with the biological reality of the moment. And Derek didn't even know he'd already been caught. Because a judge who trusts an animal's instinct more than a lawyer's rhetoric is a judge who has already decided that she believes the child. Derek took the stand again that afternoon, and his lawyer's strategy was clear. He needed to reclaim the narrative. He needed to address Emma's testimony directly, to reframe it, to plant doubt where the dog's presence had planted certainty. His lawyer, Callahan, was convinced that Derek's testimony could salvage the case. They'd prepared. They'd rehearsed. Derek knew exactly what to say. Sarah watched him walk to the stand with that peculiar confidence of a man who'd never truly experienced consequences for his actions. Derek was handsome in the way that made people want to believe him, blue eyes that seemed to radiate sincerity, features arranged in a way that suggested kindness. He wore a navy suit that was slightly less expensive than his usual wardrobe, a choice designed to make him seem relatable, vulnerable, a man caught in an impossible situation rather than an abuser caught in his own lies. He was sworn in. Callahan began with softness. "Derek, I know this is difficult, but we need to address what your daughter said this morning. Can you help the court understand what actually happened on February 14th? Derek's voice, when he spoke, carried the perfect note of wounded confusion. "Of course. I want the truth to come out. Emma means everything to me, and it breaks my heart that she's rewritten this memory in a way that paints me as some kind of monster." He paused, letting that sink in, letting his pain become the focal point. "What actually happened," Derek continued, "is that Emma was running through the kitchen. She was chasing her brother, and she didn't see me standing there. She ran into me, lost her balance, and hit her head on the counter. It was terrifying. 1 second of not paying attention and she was bleeding. I was the one who wanted to call 911. I wanted to make sure she was okay." He leaned forward slightly, his body languaged the picture of earnest sincerity. But Sarah saw an opportunity. She saw an injury and she saw a narrative. She convinced Emma that I'd pushed her. And over months of therapy, of implied suggestions, of leading questions, Emma came to believe something that isn't true. He looked directly at Emma, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom with her grandmother. "I love you, sweetheart. I'm sorry your mother did this to you." It was masterful. It was poisonous. It was exactly the kind of manipulation that had worked on Sarah for 7 years. The ability to take a truth, yes, Emma had hit her head, and wrap it in a lie that Sarah had coached her into believing it was abuse. The ability to position himself as the real victim here, the man caught between his love for his daughter and her mother's vindictive rewriting of reality. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Sarah could feel the shift happening, the calculated recalibration of belief. Callahan had done it again. He'd taken the raw emotional power of Emma's testimony and contextualized it away. He'd given people permission to doubt what they'd just witnessed. Judge Whitmore's expression remained carefully neutral as she took notes. But then something unexpected happened. Bear shifted. Not subtly, not in the way that could be dismissed as normal dog behavior. The dog's entire body went rigid. His breathing changed from the calm, measured pattern he'd maintained throughout Emma's testimony into something sharp and alert. His ears went forward, not in the way a dog's ears naturally perk when interested, but with an intensity that suggested heightened threat detection. His pupils dilated visibly. Sarah had never seen him react to Derek's voice this way before. In the 6 months since she'd separated from Derek, Bear had been in rooms with Derek during custody exchanges. The dog had been indifferent, calm, present but uninterested. But now, as Derek spoke, as he was explicitly denying something that had happened, as he was reframing abuse as parental alienation with that particular tone of wounded sincerity, Bear's entire physiology shifted into alert mode. It was like watching a biological switch flip. His breathing became shallow and rapid. His eyes widened further, the whites showing slightly. His entire body began to vibrate with a tension that suggested he was detecting something fundamentally wrong. Not anxiety, not emotional distress, but something closer to the recognition of a predator. And then, slowly, deliberately, in a movement that seemed almost ominous in its intentionality, Bear began to shake. Not a tremor, not the small shiver of a nervous dog, a full-body shake, the kind of intense physical response that meant he was detecting something critical: danger, dishonesty, a discrepancy between what he was hearing and what his nervous system was screaming at him to recognize. Judge Whitmore's entire body language shifted. She stopped writing. She looked up from her notes, and her eyes locked onto Bear with the kind of intensity usually reserved for critical evidence, for testimony that changes everything. Callahan saw it too. He immediately stood, his smooth demeanor cracking just slightly. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's dog is clearly being trained to react as a distraction to my client's testimony. This is inappropriate emotional manipulation of the court, and I move to have the animal removed from the courtroom immediately." Judge Whitmore held up her hand. When she spoke, her voice was different, sharper, more dangerous. "Counsel, sit down." There was something in that voice that made everyone understand they were witnessing a shift in how this judge was seeing the case. A woman who had been maintaining judicial neutrality was now actively engaged in investigation. "Derek," Judge Whitmore said, not looking at him, still watching the dog, "you said you wanted the truth to come out. Is that correct?" Derek's lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear, but Derek, believing in his own narrative, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, absolutely." "Then I have a question for you, and I want a direct answer. Nothing more, nothing less." Judge Whitmore finally turned to look at him. "Did you push your daughter Emma Martinez into a kitchen counter on February 14th of this year?" The room went absolutely still. Bear's entire body remained rigid, his breathing rapid, his attention laser-focused on Derek in a way that was unmistakably intentional. It was as though the dog had become a living accusation, a physical embodiment of truth demanding to be acknowledged. Derek's lawyer immediately stood. "Your Honor, I must object. My client has the right." "Counsel, sit down," Judge Whitmore said quietly. "I'm not asking for legal argument. I'm asking for an answer to a straightforward question." Derek looked at his lawyer, looked at Sarah, looked at Emma. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Some of that practiced smoothness had cracked, revealing something harder underneath, something frightened. "I don't believe that's an appropriate question without my attorney present," Derek said carefully. "That's not what I asked," Judge Whitmore replied. "I asked if you pushed your daughter into a kitchen counter, yes or no." Bear's entire body language shifted into something more extreme. His muscles tensed further. His breathing quickened to the point where Sarah could hear it from where she sat. He wasn't barking. He wasn't lunging. But he was vibrating with an intensity that suggested every nerve ending in his body was screaming a warning. Derek's composure was cracking visibly now. Sweat had appeared on his forehead. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the witness stand, were now gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Your Honor," Derek said, "I'd like to speak with my attorney before answering any more questions." It was the wrong move. It was the move of a man who had something to hide. It was the move of someone who had just realized that his carefully prepared narrative wasn't going to work, that this judge had moved beyond the realm of reasonable doubt and into the realm of active investigation. Judge Whitmore stood up slowly. The entire courtroom held its breath. "Court will recess for 1 hour," she announced. Her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "And during that recess, I want a complete veterinary and psychological evaluation of this dog on my bench, explaining exactly what training this animal possesses, what exactly it was trained to detect, and why the plaintiff felt she needed to bring it into this courtroom." She paused, let the silence build. "Because I suspect, counsel," she continued, looking directly at Callahan, "that we are not dealing with PTSD service work at all. I suspect we are dealing with something far more specific, something that responds to particular behavioral patterns. And I suspect," she said, now looking at Derek, "that this case just changed completely." She banged her gavel once, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. And in that echo, Derek understood what Sarah had always known. The truth doesn't need perfect evidence. It just needs someone willing to listen. And he'd made the fatal mistake of believing he could outmaneuver both a judge and an animal whose only job was to bear witness to the violence he'd denied. The veterinary behaviorist that Chen had contacted, Dr. Lisa Huang, who specialized in trauma detection dogs, arrived during the recess with her documentation and her credentials. She was a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who'd spent her entire career operating in spaces where science and emotion intersected uncomfortably. She carried a folder thick with research papers, training logs, video documentation. Bear's entire training record was laid bare before Judge Whitmore in her chambers. Sarah sat in the hallway outside, unable to hear but unable to leave. The waiting was its own form of torture. Maria held her hand, her fingers warm and steady against Sarah's ice-cold skin. "What did you do?" Maria whispered, her voice urgent with both fear and something that might have been admiration. "What is that dog trained to do?" Sarah took a shaky breath that didn't quite fill her lungs. "Detect lies, sort of, that's not. It's not magic, but there's research. Subtle physiological signs, heart rate changes, breathing patterns, stress hormone releases through sweat. Abusers have a specific profile when they're lying, when they're in denial, when they're reframing abuse as something else. Bear was trained to identify that specific pattern, the way a body responds when someone is actively engaged in deception about harm they've caused." "Is that even legal?" Maria's voice was panicked now, her protective older sister instinct kicking into overdrive. "Sarah, can they use that against you? Can they say you manipulated the court?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. The truth hung in the air between them like a confession. "I had to try. The system wasn't working. The evidence wasn't enough. A therapist's notes and a child's testimony aren't enough when you're facing a man with money and charm and a lawyer who specializes in making abusers sound like victims. And Bear," she looked down at the dog who lay across both her feet, his breathing having finally slowed, his eyes soft but alert. "Bear has watched Derek hurt us. He's lived in that house. He's felt the fear in every room, and he was trained to respond to that danger signature." They sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. Then a bailiff opened the door and gestured for Sarah to return to the courtroom. Judge Whitmore sat on the bench, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were sharp with something that might have been fury. She'd clearly had a difficult conversation with Dr. Huang. There were documents spread across her desk, research papers, training protocols, video files of Bear responding to various scenarios. "I've reviewed the documentation," Judge Whitmore said, and her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "And I need to be very clear with everyone in this courtroom. The use of an animal as a purported lie detector is not and will not be admissible in a court of law. It is pseudoscience. It is manipulative, and it's grounds for me to consider this a contempt of court and a misuse of these proceedings." Sarah's world fell apart. She heard Maria gasp behind her. She felt the weight of judgment crashing down, not from Derek, but from the very system that was supposed to protect her. She'd brought an animal into a sacred space, had violated the rules of evidence, had essentially cheated. The judge was going to dismiss her case on procedural grounds. Derek was going to win. But then Judge Whitmore continued. "However," she said, and the word hung in the courtroom like a reprieve, "I am not going to charge Ms. Martinez with contempt. I am going to do something else instead." Everyone leaned forward. "I am going to use what I observed," Judge Whitmore continued, "not as evidence, but as a framework for further investigation. What I witnessed this morning was an animal responding to particular behavioral markers. Whether or not those markers constitute scientific proof of deception is irrelevant to what I'm about to do next." She looked directly at Derek. "Mr. Martinez, I have questions about your testimony, specifically about the February incident with your daughter, and I'm going to ask you to answer them under oath with the full knowledge that you are subject to perjury charges. Because what I'm interested in now is not what the dog thinks. I'm interested in what you say when you understand that someone, a judge, an animal, fate, God, is watching very closely." Derek's face had gone completely white. His lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, my client reserves the right to—" "Sit down," Judge Whitmore said. Her voice was the sound of absolute authority, the kind that couldn't be argued with or negotiated around. "I'm not asking about legal strategy. I'm asking about the truth, and Mr. Martinez is going to answer." The courtroom was completely silent. All 300 pounds of judge authority was focused like a laser on one man, and that man was realizing, with the kind of slow-motion horror of someone watching their entire world collapse, that the judge had seen something in his behavior. She had made her own assessment, independent of the dog, and had found him wanting. "Did you or did you not push your daughter Emma into a kitchen counter on February 14th of this year?" Judge Whitmore asked. Derek's mouth opened, closed. His hands began to shake visibly now. Sarah could see the tremor even from where she sat. His eyes darted to his lawyer, to his daughter, to Sarah, to the judge. And in that moment the choice became unavoidable. He could lie again, and everyone in this room would know it. He could invoke his right to counsel and admit by silence that he'd done it, or he could tell the truth. His voice cracked. He tried again. "I want to invoke my right not to self-incriminate." He wasn't denying it. He was refusing to lie again on the record. And in that refusal, everyone in the courtroom understood exactly what had happened. He'd done it. He'd pushed a child. He'd lied about it to a judge. He'd coached himself to sound sincere while describing a fiction. And when confronted by nothing but a judicious question, a careful examination of his own words and the implied threat that truth was being pursued, he'd broken completely. Emma made a sound from the back, not quite a gasp, something closer to a release, like she could finally exhale. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a gesture that suggested the weight of what she'd just done, the responsibility of having to see something that most people would have missed. "What I understand now," the judge said slowly, "is that this case is no longer about what the dog detected. It's about what I detected. And what I detected was a man who would rather invoke his constitutional rights than repeat his lies on the record a second time in front of a judge who was clearly listening for inconsistencies." She put her glasses back on. "We will adjourn for the day. I want both counsel to prepare closing arguments, but I want to be clear. Mr. Martinez's choice to invoke his rights, rather than deny the allegations again, will be noted in my decision." Derek's lawyer was already whispering urgently to his client, but Derek wasn't listening. He was looking at Emma, And in that look, Sarah saw something shift. Not remorse, Derek wasn't capable of genuine remorse, but recognition, understanding that he'd lost, that the game was over, that his daughter had told the truth and a judge had believed her. And Sarah understood in that moment that Derek hadn't been defeated by a dog's behavior or by perfect evidence or by a flawless legal strategy. He'd been defeated by the simple act of being truly seen, by a judge who was paying attention, by a system that, for once, chose to listen carefully when a man's story didn't match his physiology. Because truth, she understood now, wasn't about perfect proof. It was about someone being willing to look closely enough to see it. Judge Whitmore ordered a 30-minute recess, and the courtroom erupted into chaos. Derek's lawyer was practically dragging him toward the back room, his face the color of old newspaper. Sarah could see the calculation happening in Callahan's eyes. The judge has already made her decision, and it's not in our favor. Time to minimize damage. The journalists were on their phones, already writing the story in real time. Sarah could imagine the headlines forming. Judge orders recess after abuser invokes right to silence. Custody case takes dramatic turn. Sarah's mother was crying into Maria's shoulder, rosary beads still moving through her trembling fingers. Emma was being held by her therapist, who'd been sitting in the courtroom specifically for this reason. The woman, Dr. Patterson, who'd been seeing Emma for 4 months, was whispering something into the girl's ear. Not reassurance, Sarah realized, but validation. You did it. You told the truth. You were brave. And Bear followed Sarah into the hallway, pressed against her leg, his work now complete in a way that nobody could have predicted. The dog's entire demeanor had shifted from alert back to calm. His breathing had normalized, but his eyes remained focused on Sarah with the intensity of something, who'd completed a mission. Sarah sat on a bench in the hallway with her hand on the dog's head, waiting. The courthouse hallway smelled of old tile and the institutional perfume they used to clean bathrooms. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past them, deliberately not making eye contact, understanding that something significant was happening and choosing not to participate in it. During the recess, while Sarah waited in the hallway, Derek's lawyer made an approach. Chen found Sarah before Derek's team could corner her officially. She pulled her aside, away from Maria and her mother, to a quiet corner near the bathrooms. Off the record, Chen said, her voice low and urgent, Callahan wants to make an offer. He's terrified. The judge just shut down Derek's testimony, and she made it clear she doesn't believe anything he's said. He's offering to concede on custody. Sarah's heart began to race. Concede. Derek will agree to reduced visitation. Supervised visitation only. He will accept a restraining order preventing direct contact with you except through counsel. He will drop all custody claims, meaning you get primary physical and legal custody of both children, full decision-making authority. He wants in exchange that no assault charges are filed. Chen paused, letting this sink in. In other words, Chen continued, he's giving up. He's admitting defeat by accepting a settlement that no man would ever accept if he believed he was innocent. Sarah stood frozen. The hallway suddenly felt very small. The fluorescent light above her head was making a high-pitched buzzing sound that she'd somehow not noticed before. This was what victory looked like. Not a triumphant moment of being believed, but a quiet surrender, a man cutting his losses. A system so broken that sometimes the only way to win was to let your dog sit in court and make a judge question whether she was really looking at the truth, and then hope that judge was paying attention. What do you want to do? Chen asked gently. Sarah thought about Emma, about Lucas, about waking up every morning for the past 6 months knowing that the man who'd hurt her might still take her children away. About the court system that had seemed designed to protect men like Derek, men with money, charm, lawyers who understood that reasonable doubt was a weapon. Tell him yes, Sarah said quietly. Tell him we accept. During the afternoon session, Derek didn't take the stand. His lawyer requested that they move directly to judgment based on the settlement agreement, and Judge Whitmore agreed with a nod that suggested she'd been expecting this exact outcome. "I have reviewed all testimony and evidence," Judge Whitmore said, her voice formal but carrying undeniable weight. "I have also reviewed a settlement agreement submitted by both parties. I find that there is substantial evidence of physical abuse and emotional coercion within the home. I find that the children are at risk when unsupervised with the defendant. Therefore, I am awarding primary physical and legal custody to the plaintiff, Sarah Martinez, effective immediately." Emma made a sound from the back row, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and something closer to the vocalization of grief finally being released. Her entire body went limp against her grandmother, not from weakness, but from the collapse of tension she'd been holding for 6 months. "The defendant will have visitation rights limited to supervised settings under a court-appointed monitor," Judge Whitmore continued. "I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting direct contact with the plaintiff, except through counsel, and I am requiring the defendant to enroll in and complete a domestic violence intervention program before any modification to this order will be considered." Derek sat frozen in his chair at the defendant's table, his entire body language suggesting he couldn't quite believe what was happening. His lawyer had his hand on Derek's shoulder, a gesture that was either congratulatory or restraining. Sarah couldn't tell which. Then Judge Whitmore did something remarkable. She looked directly at Sarah, and then she looked at Bear. "I want to be on the record," the judge said, saying that while the use of an untrained animal as evidence is inappropriate, the presence of this dog in this courtroom may have prevented this case from being dismissed on insufficient evidence alone. The dog did not testify. The dog did not speak, but the dog bears witness. And sometimes the truth is protected not by law but by something more fundamental, by loyalty. By the capacity of a creature to sense when harm is being done, and to refuse to participate in the lie that denies it. She adjusted her glasses, a gesture that suggested the weight of what she just said, the knowledge that she just stepped outside the bounds of typical judicial language. "I find that the defendant's decision to invoke his constitutional rights, rather than repeat his denials under oath in front of this court, constitutes an implicit admission of the allegations. Case closed." She banged her gavel once. The parking lot outside the courthouse was swarming with journalists. Sarah held Emma's hand and Bear's leash, Lucas walking on her other side with his small hand gripping her jacket. They moved through the crowd like they were walking through fire. "Ms. Martinez, how do you feel? What will you do now? Can you comment on the role of your service dog?" She didn't stop. She didn't speak. She just kept moving toward her car, her children beside her, their dog in front of them, and the weight of everything that had happened settling onto her shoulders like fresh snow, heavy, wet, cold. Maria caught up with them at the car. She opened the back door and the kids climbed in, their bodies moving on autopilot. Sarah stood for a moment, holding Bear's leash, and felt the full force of her exhaustion hit her like a physical thing. It wasn't the tiredness of sleep deprivation. It was the exhaustion of sustained fear finally being released. "You did it," Maria said, wrapping her arms around her sister. "You actually did it." But Sarah didn't feel victorious. She felt wrung out. She felt the weight of 7 years of abuse, 6 months of legal battle, and the knowledge that Derek would still have supervised visits with her children. That there would be no jail time. That he'd pay minimal consequences for what he'd done, a requirement to take anger management classes, the humiliation of supervised visitation, the loss of custody. These were consequences, yes, but they felt small compared to the harm he'd caused. But her children were safe. That was something, that was everything. She drove home in silence while Emma and Lucas slept in the back seat, their bodies finally relaxed enough to let go of the tension they'd been carrying. Their faces, in sleep, looked younger, looked like children again rather than small adults forced to carry secrets. Bear rode beside her in the passenger seat, his head resting on her leg, his breathing steady and present. His job was done. He'd borne witness. He'd made the invisible visible. He'd forced a system built to protect men like Derek to look closely at what it had been ignoring. At home, Sarah let the kids get ready for bed, tucked them in, and sat with Emma for an extra 10 minutes just to make sure she knew she was safe. To make sure the girl understood that nothing that had happened was her fault, that her testimony had mattered, that her truth had been believed. When she came back downstairs, she sat on the kitchen floor, the same kitchen floor where Derek had pushed their daughter's head into the counter, and let herself cry. Not tears of joy, tears of grief. Grief for the years she'd lost to his deception. Grief for the trauma Emma and Lucas would carry forever. Grief for the system that had failed her until she'd had to break its rules to make it work. Bear laid his head in her lap, his warm weight an anchor against the darkness. And Sarah understood. Justice in America wasn't about righteousness winning. It was about someone being willing to listen carefully enough to hear the truth underneath the lies. It was about a dog whose only testimony was presence. It was about a judge who decided to pay attention. It was about a child who'd found the courage to speak. And it was about the complicated reality that winning felt like surviving, that justice felt like relief mixed with grief, and that sometimes the only way the system worked was when someone was brave enough to ask it to. 6 days after the verdict, Sarah's life had become unrecognizable. The image had spread faster than she could have imagined. A photograph captured by one of the journalists in the courtroom at the exact moment Bear pressed his body against Emma's chair. In the image, Emma's face was wet with tears, her body language the perfect picture of trauma. And Bear, his amber eyes locked on her face, his entire body language communicating loyalty and protection. It was the kind of photograph that looked like it had been staged, like it was too perfect to be real. But it was real, and it had been shared 1.2 million times in the first week. Sarah's phone had become a device of constant notifications. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. News outlets wanted to interview her. Domestic violence organizations wanted to feature her story on their websites. A lawyer had contacted her about a civil suit against Derek. A fund had been started to help her pay legal fees, not knowing that she'd already paid them, that Chen had significantly reduced her rates once she'd understood the nature of the case. The fund had raised $50,000 in a single week, before Sarah had asked them to stop accepting donations and redirect the money to a women's shelter instead. But the requests kept coming. A documentary filmmaker named James Peterson had called 3 times. He wanted to follow Sarah's family for 6 months. He wanted to capture the healing journey. He wanted to tell her story to the world. His production company had done work for Netflix. This could be huge, he'd said. This could help other women. A children's book author named Rebecca Sinclair wanted to write about the brave dog who saved a family. She'd sent sample illustrations of an idealized bear, less realistic animal, more noble steed. The book would be for ages 6 to 10, teaching children about the power of animals and courage. Sarah would receive royalties. A startup called Truthbound had contacted her wanting to hire her as a consultant on training trauma detection dogs for other cases. They believed they could scale this model. They believed Bear's work proved that animals could detect deception in ways that human systems couldn't. They offered her $200,000 a year plus equity. All of these offers came with the same underlying assumption that what had happened in that courtroom was a miracle, that Bear had performed magic, that Sarah had discovered some revolutionary new approach to justice. Sarah had turned them all down. Because the truth, which had become increasingly clear as she watched her story transform into mythology, was far more complicated than the narrative people wanted to believe. On a Tuesday evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen, no longer the site of trauma now, but increasingly the site of her own reckoning with what had happened, and opened her laptop to search herself. The results were overwhelming. Dog saves custody case, justice through loyalty. Service dog detects abuse and helps judge make historic decision. This woman brought her dog to court and changed everything. The incredible true story of Bear, the dog who testified without speaking. The articles were beautiful. They were inspiring. They were completely divorced from what had actually occurred. In most of these narratives, Bear had detected Derek's lies. The dog had testified through his behavior. Sarah had been a genius for bringing him to court. Judge Whitmore had been revolutionary for recognizing the dog's evidence. Derek had been exposed through this miraculous intersection of science and loyalty. But that wasn't what had happened. What had actually happened was, a judge had decided to pay very close attention. A man had become frightened enough to stop lying. A child had found the courage to speak. And an animal, trained by humans to recognize certain behavioral patterns, had done exactly what he'd been trained to do. There was no miracle in that. There was just attention. There was just a system finally working the way it was supposed to work when someone was invested in making it work. There was a judge who decided to listen. But that narrative didn't sell. That narrative didn't inspire. That narrative didn't suggest that the system itself could be fixed. So instead, the world had created a mythology where a dog was a truth detector, where justice could be as simple as bringing the right animal to the right courtroom, where Sarah had discovered a revolutionary new approach to exposing abusers. Sarah closed her laptop and put her head on the kitchen table. The media attention had real consequences for her children. Lucas had come home from school on Thursday saying that kids had been asking if their dog could read minds. Emma had found her photo, the one of her crying in court, printed in a local magazine with the caption, "Brave daughter tells her truth." They'd put it on the school bulletin board, and Emma had become simultaneously a symbol of courage and a girl everyone now pitied. Sarah had taken the photo down herself, walking into the school with Maria, and asking the principal to explain why a child's trauma had been turned into a school poster. "We thought it was inspirational," the principal had said, genuinely confused. "It's exploitative," Sarah had replied quietly. The principal had looked hurt. She'd only been trying to celebrate the children's bravery. This was the thing nobody seemed to understand. Trauma wasn't inspirational. Abuse wasn't a platform. A child speaking truth about her father's violence wasn't a beautiful moment to be framed and displayed. It was a tragedy that had to happen in order to escape further tragedy. One afternoon, Sarah received a call from Judge Whitmore's office. The judge wanted to meet with her privately. No lawyers, just Sarah and the judge in the judge's chambers. Sarah sat across from Judge Whitmore in the same room where Bear's training records had been examined. The judge looked tired. She'd clearly been carrying the weight of the case longer than the verdict. "I wanted to tell you something," Judge Whitmore said, "that I couldn't say in open court. What you did, bringing that dog into my courtroom, was technically improper. I could have sanctioned you. I could have dismissed your case on procedural grounds." Sarah's heart began to race. "But," the judge continued, "I've been on the bench for 34 years, and I have dismissed too many cases based on insufficient evidence when I suspected abuse was occurring. I've watched good lawyers make bad cases sound worse. I've watched charming men convince juries of their innocence while they hid their hands behind their backs. And your dog forced me to do something I should have been doing all along. Pay very close attention to the person being questioned." She paused. "That dog didn't prove Derek guilty. You understand that, right? Derek proved Derek guilty by refusing to deny the accusation again, by understanding that you and I and that animal had all seen through his performance. The dog was just permission for me to trust my own observation instead of hiding behind the rules of evidence." Sarah felt tears forming. "The world is turning your story into mythology," Judge Whitmore continued. "And I'm telling you now, don't let them. Don't let them turn a difficult truth into an easy miracle. The system didn't change. The law didn't change. One judge paid attention, that's all. And next time there might be a judge who doesn't. There might be a woman who doesn't have a trained dog. There might be a child who can't find the courage to speak in front of strangers. The miracle narrative is dangerous because it suggests that if you just do this one thing, bring the right animal, say the right words, you'll get justice. But justice isn't that simple. It's fragile. It depends on the specific judge, the specific moment, the specific luck of circumstances aligning. Sarah wiped her eyes. "I'm telling you this," Judge Whitmore said, "because I see what's happening to your story. I see the books being written, the documentaries being proposed, the companies wanting to scale this into a business model. And I'm telling you, the truth is more important than the narrative. Your real story, the one where you had to break the rules, where you had to risk contempt charges, where you had to depend on a judge's attention rather than scientific proof, that's the important story. That's the story that might actually change something, because it tells the truth about how justice really works. Imperfectly, temporarily, dependent on human beings choosing to pay attention." That conversation changed something in Sarah. She started writing things down, not for publication but for clarity, the real story of what had happened, the legal strategy, the desperation that had driven her to an unconventional approach, the way the system had almost failed her, the way one judge's attention had made the difference, the way the world had turned it into something else entirely. She realized that refusing the offers, the documentaries, the books, the consulting jobs, wasn't enough. She had to actively protect the truth of what had happened by telling it accurately. So she began giving interviews, but not to sell a narrative, to complicate it. "Bear didn't prove Derek guilty," she told reporters. "A judge paying attention proved Derek guilty. I didn't discover a revolutionary new approach to justice," she told the documentary filmmaker. "I broke the rules and got lucky." "The system is still broken," she told the children's book author. "One verdict doesn't change that." Slowly, the mythology began to crack. The simpler narrative, dog saves family, competed with the more complex one. Woman risks legal sanction to force judge to really listen to her child's testimony. The second narrative was less marketable, less inspirational, less miracle-like. But it was true. And Sarah understood, finally, that protecting the truth of what had happened was more important than letting it be transformed into the kind of story that made people feel good about a broken system. Because if they believed in the dog's power, they wouldn't demand that judges actually pay attention. If they believed in the miracle, they wouldn't fight for systemic change. And the next woman, the next child, the next family wouldn't have the luck that Sarah had found. 6 months later, Sarah sat in Dr. Torr's office, not as a client anymore, but as someone who'd finally reached stability on the other side of crisis. Emma was doing better, not healed. Healing from abuse isn't linear, isn't complete, isn't something you can measure with a timestamp, but better. She'd stopped flinching at loud noises. She'd stopped apologizing for things that weren't her fault. She'd started laughing again, real laughter that didn't have an edge of hysteria to it. Lucas had started school sports, something he'd been too anxious to try before. His stutter was still there, but it was less pronounced. He was sleeping through the night most nights. The nightmares that had plagued him for months had diminished to occasional rather than nightly. And Bear. Bear had become something Sarah hadn't entirely expected. Not a symbol, not a miracle worker, just a dog who'd been trained to recognize trauma and who continued to live his life doing what he'd always done, bearing witness to his family's existence. He hadn't become famous in the way Sarah had feared. He'd become something quieter, a presence, a comfort, a living reminder that someone, something, had seen what was happening and refused to look away. Sarah had started working with a nonprofit called Safe Harbor, which helped women in domestic violence situations access better legal representation and psychological support. She consulted on cases, prepared testimony, helped women tell their stories in ways that the legal system might actually listen to. It was unpaid work, though Safe Harbor had offered her a position. She declined the salary but accepted the work. because she understood now that the real work wasn't in the courtroom. It wasn't in the dramatic moments when judges finally paid attention. The real work was in the quiet conversations with women who were still trapped in situations that looked like Sarah's had looked 5 years ago. Women who had no one listening, no sympathetic judge, no trained dog, no sister sitting in the courtroom taking notes. The work was in patience, in repetition, in showing women that there were ways out, even if those ways weren't always simple or clean or final. Derek's supervised visitation had happened 3 times. The first time, Lucas had come home and said it was weird. The second time, Emma had refused to go, and Sarah had had to explain, carefully, delicately, that her daughter could not be forced to see her father, that the court had given her that choice once she reached a certain age. The third time, Derek had shown up late, had spent the hour trying to convince Lucas that his mother had manipulated the court, that the dog had been some kind of trick, that the real victim in this story was him. Lucas had come home and repeated some of what Derek had said to his mother. Sarah had sat with her son, had validated that his father loved him, and had also told him the truth. Sometimes people we love do things that hurt us. Sometimes they try to convince us that the hurt didn't happen, or that we deserved it, or that we should forgive them without them ever apologizing or changing. That's called gaslighting, Sarah had told him, and you're allowed to not want to see someone who does that to you. Lucas hadn't asked to go back. Emma had made it clear she wouldn't be going to any more supervised visits. At 14, she had the legal right to refuse. Derek had filed a motion to compel her participation, but Judge Whitmore had denied it, noting that forcing a child to spend time with an abuser violated the spirit if not the letter of the law. Derek still paid child support. He still existed in their lives in the way that absent fathers exist, a presence defined by absence, a constant low-level reminder that he hadn't changed, that he still believed he'd done nothing wrong, that the world had been unfair to him. Sarah had learned to live with that. Some victories weren't about complete erasure of the harm. They were about creating distance, safety, the ability to breathe. One afternoon, Sarah received an email from a woman named Patricia Chen, not her lawyer Patricia Chen, but a different woman. The email was brief. I'm writing a thesis on trauma-informed legal strategies in custody cases. Your case was cited in 3 separate journals. I wanted to thank you for being willing to let your story be complicated. Most people in your position would have leaned into the miracle narrative. The fact that you didn't, that you actively worked against it, has made your case far more useful to legal scholars trying to actually understand what works and what doesn't in family law. Sarah had read the email 3 times. She'd never thought about her story as useful to legal scholars. She'd thought about it as her life, as her children's trauma, as the specific moment when she decided to break the rules and hope that a judge was paying attention. But understanding that her honesty might change how future cases were handled, that was meaningful in a way that the book deals and documentary offers had never been. On a Friday evening in early spring, Sarah sat on her back porch with Emma and Lucas and Bear, watching the sunset over their small yard. The yard had been transformed over the winter. Sarah had removed the deck where Derek used to stand while smoking and intimidating her. She'd planted a garden. She'd put a swing set in that Lucas had already mostly outgrown, but that Emma used sometimes when she needed to think. It was small, it was ordinary, it was theirs. Bear lay at Sarah's feet, his head resting on her leg, his breathing steady and present. He'd aged in the 6 months since the trial. His muzzle was grayer. He moved a little more slowly, but his presence was the same, steady, witnessing, loyal. "Do you think Dad still thinks he did nothing wrong?" Lucas asked suddenly, the question coming from nowhere in the way that children's questions often do. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the truth versus the lie that might make her son feel better. "Yes," she said finally. "I think he believes he did nothing wrong, or he's chosen to believe that. I think those things are the same thing for some people." "That's sad," Lucas said. "It is," Sarah agreed, "because he can't change anything about himself if he doesn't think there's anything to change." Emma, who'd been lying on the porch swing reading, spoke without looking up from her book. "Good. I don't want him to change. I want him to just leave us alone." And that was honesty, not forgiveness, not redemption, not the kind of resolution that made for good stories, just the clear, uncomplicated desire to be left in peace. Sarah reached over and squeezed Emma's shoulder. Judge Whitmore had retired 3 months after the verdict. Sarah had received a note from her, handwritten, on official stationery, explaining that she'd decided it was time. She'd done what she could. She'd seen what the system was capable of when someone paid very close attention, and she'd seen, increasingly, what happened when judges didn't pay that kind of attention. The contrast had become unbearable. The note had ended. "I'm going to spend my retirement reading about trauma, about how it affects the brain, about how truth-telling works, about why we believe some people and not others, because I realized at the end of my career that I'd been trained in procedure but not in human beings. You taught me that, and that dog taught me that. Thank you." Sarah had framed the note and hung it in her home office, next to the single photo of Bear that she'd kept from the trial. Not the viral one, but a quiet moment between court sessions where the dog was simply resting his head, fully present, fully witnessing. A year after the verdict, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a conference on trauma-informed legal practices. The organizers wanted her to talk about her case, about what had worked, about what she'd learned. She'd almost declined, but then she'd thought about the woman who'd sent the email about her thesis, about all the legal scholars and advocates who were trying to understand how the system could better serve people who'd been harmed. So she'd said yes. At the conference, standing in front of a room of lawyers and judges and advocates, Sarah had been clear about one thing. There is no dog that will fix the system. There is no secret strategy that will guarantee justice. What happened in my case was, one judge decided to pay very close attention. One child found the courage to speak. One man broke under questioning, and I was lucky. I had money for a lawyer. I had a sympathetic judge. I had a trained animal. Most women don't have any of these things. So we can't celebrate my case as if it's a template for how the system works. We have to look at it as a reminder of how broken the system is, that it required all of these specific circumstances to produce a just outcome. She talked about Bear, but not as a miracle worker, as a tool, as something that had given her permission to trust her own instincts about what was true. An animal's response to human behavior isn't a legal argument, she'd said, but sometimes a judge needs permission to trust what they already know. Sometimes we all need permission to trust what we see and hear. The dog was just that permission. The real work was the judge choosing to listen. On a quiet evening in late autumn, 1 year after the trial, Sarah sat on her back porch again with Emma and Lucas and Bear. The yard had fully become theirs now. The trauma that had lived in this space had been slowly replaced with new rituals, new memories, new ordinary moments strung together like beads on a string. Sarah let herself imagine what might have happened if Bear hadn't been trained the way he was, if Derek's lawyer had been more skilled, if Judge Whitmore had decided not to pay such close attention, if Emma hadn't found the courage to speak. The what-ifs were paralyzing. So she focused on what was: 2 children who felt safe, a mother who could breathe again, a future that wasn't written by someone who'd learned to lie so convincingly that nobody questioned him anymore. Bear pressed his head against her leg, as he always did, as though he understood the weight of her thoughts. "I know," she whispered to him, "we made it." And in the darkness of the coming night, with her children safe inside and the rest of the world moving on to the next crisis, the next story, the next person desperate for their own version of justice, Sarah held her dog and understood something fundamental. The system hadn't changed. The law was still imperfect. Derek hadn't faced real consequences beyond losing custody. The world still turned stories of trauma into mythology, but she had chosen to speak her truth anyway. And she had found, in the most unlikely of places, in the body of a dog, in the attention of a judge, in the courage of a child, something that made that truth impossible to ignore. Sometimes justice wasn't cinematic. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was a dog's head resting on your leg in the darkness, a silent agreement that everything that had been hidden was finally real. And sometimes that had to be enough. And